this is going to be a little different than the previous talks. It's related more to Carrie's other work. Mark Twain. Yeah, sure thing. It's going to be related more to Carrie's other work, Mark Twain Among the Indians, questions of nativity and indigeneity in Twain. But also, I've been fortunate enough to have a few conversations going with people about questions of dialect in Twain, which is a big part of my interest in him. So that's what this talk is going to be about. So, Huckleberry Finn's Effect of Indigeneity, Native Erasure and Law in Literature. When Mark Twain first began to publish selected chapters from his autobiography in 1906, to dovetail with the previous talk, he joked that he would never be able to complete the entire thing. Even if I should live long enough to finish, he insisted, this set of volumes could not be contained merely in a city. It would require a state. Although his language might have been facetious, the concern it framed was serious enough. What kind of literature would actually require a state to contain it? For Twain and his contemporaries, the question went beyond the geographical. It was a matter of national identity. What stylistic features might be said to link American writing to the states from which it came? By the late 19th century, the ambition to make American literature sound more American had so consumed the country's authors that even the notoriously apolitical Twain found himself swept up in the cause. The colossal national question, as he informed a British journalist in 1889, is whether our people are going to continue to imbibe foreign ideas from foreign writers, or whether we would get a national literature, the spread of national sentiments, national thought, and national morals instead. At its core, Twain's concern was less about politics than about prose style. He was so disgusted by the overblown romantic rhetoric of British writers like Sir Walter Scott that he encouraged American writers to be as irreverent, coarse, vulgar, and ribald as they possibly could. For his part, he boasted, he did not speak English at all, he only spoke American. In his writing, he consciously devoted himself to capturing all the new words, changed meanings, and alterations in our pronunciation that distinguished writers of the American language from the old conventional English forms. Then I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. I figure people in this audience are probably pretty familiar with this quote from Hemingway. But the origins of American literature, that it is this question, for me, my argument is that Huck is becoming this voice of the nation, but he's doing so through this foundational act of native erasure that parallels the logic of birthright citizenship in the United States, which is taking place during the exact same time period as Twain's literary careers. As he's writing his fiction, it's working its way through the courts. We have this series of Supreme Court cases. What does it mean to be a native-born American? This is a new invention in law, and it's a new invention in the world. So this slide is just a preview of my argument to come. So it should become clearer over time. Twain managed to turn Huck's language into a metonym for the country as a whole, but only by displacing and reformulating the Injun English in Life on the Mississippi that framed Huck's earliest appearance on the page. So this is an early lost chapter of Huckleberry Finn. Because Huck's voice relies on the same kind of native erasure that was used to justify the dispossession of the country's indigenous tribes, Huckleberry Finn reveals the extent to which American literature relies on a fundamentally imperialist logic. Following the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, the Supreme Court found itself struggling to articulate why it was that Native Americans could never count as native-born Americans. In this context, writers like Twain succeeded in giving the country its native tongue by transforming the language of the colonizer into a distinctively homegrown American idiom. American dialect literature managed to inculcate a sense of native belonging, but only at the expense of actual native peoples. In this dialectic of nativity, native erasure serves as the precondition for the invention of the native-born American, in American literature as well as in American law. No one could have articulated this dialectic of nativity better than Twain himself, who insisted that Europeans could have nothing whatsoever to teach Americans about the art of novel writing. Does the native novelist try to generalize the nation? No. he lays plainly before you the ways and speech and life of a few people grouped in a certain place, his own place, and that is one book. In time, he and his brethren will report to you the life and the people of the whole nation, in 50 states and territories, 100 patches of life and groups of people in a dozen widely separated cities. And the Indians will be attended to, and the cowboys, and the gold and silver miners, and the Negroes. And when 1,000 able novels have been written, there you have the soul of the people, the life of the people, the speech of the people, and not anywhere else can these be had. So Twain is definitely not the only one writing in dialect at this point. It's everyone who wants to make it into the high literary journals at the time. It's really a widespread phenomenon, and even as he's lightly satirizing it here, he's kind of giving the best articulation of the project out there. As one of the country's preeminent native novelists, Twain's role is to capture the speech of the people in his own place, a project in which the Indians will be attended to, but not permitted to participate, because according to this worldview, native most emphatically means white. In this framework, national literature becomes a technology of imperialism that serves to unify America's heterogeneous states and territories through an underlying logic of racial exclusion. The Indians, like the Negroes, get characterized as racial minorities that exist to define the national landscape without retaining any particular claim to the land itself. They form part of the patchwork of American life, but only according to the logic of metonymy, in which all inhabitants of the country serve equally well as stand-ins for the nation on the page. The Indians share their ability to represent the West with the cowboys and gold and silver miners, whose incursions actually displace them from their land. So according to this kind of anti-native thinking, the Indians can make no claim to contribute to Western literature themselves. For, according to Twain, the Indian tales, so often romanticized by outsiders, turn out to be poor stuff, exceedingly sorry rubbish. In this context, speaking American has nothing to do with speaking Lakota, Washoe, or Paiute, but instead involves speaking the language of the colonizer in a suitably stateside twang, imagined as if springing up from the soil of its own volition. For Twain, this kind of regional American dialect represented the richest natural inheritance of the American writer. No foreigner could ever hope to report the nation's speech, he insisted, because it was acquirable in only one way, years and years of unconscious absorption, adding, "I should be astonished to see a foreigner get at the right meanings, catch the elusive shades of these subtle things." Twain was hardly alone in championing dialect writing. His lifelong friend and editor at The Atlantic, William Dean Howells, obsessively promoted all the carefully distinguished local accents that would enable native writers, native in the vernacular, to write literature native to the soil. Yet even an enthusiast like Howells had to admit the difficulty inherent in creating an effect of indigeneity within a tradition of English literature that did not originate indigenously. Traditionally, critics have interpreted Twain's use of dialect as a means of working through the most deep-seated divides of the Civil War. Eric Lott, for instance, sees a ventriloquized dialect taken from blackface minstrelsy, whereas Michael North sees white mimicry delimiting an antebellum way of life. I argue, in contrast, that dialect has less to do with reenacting the days of slavery than relitigating its end, as in the moment when millions of formerly enslaved people were suddenly designated native-born citizens, a status simultaneously denied to actual natives. Ever since the 1950s, critics like Ralph Ellison have insisted that what really matters in a work like Huckleberry Finn is the way it succeeds, or fails to succeed, at capturing the irrepressible moral reality of the Negro. Yet, as Carrie Driscoll has recently pointed out, far too little has been said about Twain's relation to 19th century America's other major racial issue, the dispossession and attempted extermination of the country's indigenous population. I argue that Twain's participation in the project of native erasure, from the fictional annihilation of Injun Joe to the real-life annihilation of the Oglala Lakota, matters in part because it forms the unacknowledged precursor to Twain's development of a distinctly American prose style. Huck's language may have granted American writers the effect of indigeneity they needed to liberate themselves from the British tradition, but it could only do so by silencing the actual indigenous peoples that might have otherwise asserted their own claim to speak for the land. In giving voice to the logic of settler colonialism, Twain offered the nation what the actual birthright citizenship clause cannot, namely, a version of what it meant to be native to the soil that precluded native peoples by definition. In the legal context, Twain's intervention mattered because the birthright citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment, which barred natives from citizenship by, quote, excluding Indians not taxed, had presented the American court system with a distinct conundrum ever since its passage in 1868. Given that this was the era of legal formalism, which held that the legitimacy of the law derived from its flawless consistency, the court system found itself struggling to defend the paradox that Native Americans could never count as native-born Americans. This was because birthright citizenship was premised on the principle of jus soli, of the soil, which required taking a legal precedent from the British common law and applying it on stolen tribal land, where natives whose ancestry dated back generations could never count as citizens, but settlers who had crossed an ocean to get there could raise their children as born Americans. According to legal historians, long after even the 14th Amendment would have seemed to have settled the score, quote, the federal government failed to follow a consistent approach in determining the legal and political status of Native Americans. The matter came to a head in 1884, which was, maybe not coincidentally, the same year as the publication of Huckleberry Finn. That was when the Supreme Court faced a challenge, went ahead a bit, from John Elk, who, despite having long since renounced his tribal allegiance, continued to be denied the right to vote. The court ruled that Native Americans like Elk could not claim the rights of citizenship because they were officially not part of the people of the United States, meaning that absent formal treaties with the U.S. government, they were doomed to remain alien nations, distinct political communities, with whom the United States might and habitually did deal as they thought fit. Not until the Native American Citizenship Act of 1924 would all Native Americans be granted citizenship. Yet there was no defensible legal justification for such a two-tiered system of citizenship that did not simply reassert the imperialist prerogative with which the U.S. government had habitually treated natives ever since the colonial era. So there's no actual legal framework for this other than just we want it to be that way. And this is the context in which American literature has this really distinctive role to play, working through this logic. How is it possible to have native mean something other than native? Amidst this royal legal controversy, Twain's dialect writing managed to put forth a much clearer articulation of the imperialist principles undergirding American belonging than anything the court system was able to offer. Huckleberry Finn served to advance the project of native dispossession by putting into literary language that which was not possible to frame in legal terms, a version of native belonging that could never be made to accommodate native peoples. We can best see this by examining the earliest appearance of Huck's narrative voice in print. And I have to give kudos to Matt Siebold here for first pointing me in this direction. It's an amazing lost chapter. It's in Twain's travelogue, Life on the Mississippi. Came out just about a year before the publication of Huckleberry Finn. Near the beginning of this work, Twain, by way of illustrating keelboat talk and manners, decides to throw in a chapter from a book which I have been working at about an ignorant village boy, Huck Finn. Although this missing chapter appears nowhere in the final novel, it contains crucial clues as to the provenance of Huck's eminently American speech. Specifically, Huck's language, in its facile appropriation of native imagery, denies actual native voices any claim to Americanness at all. And while critics have long recognized certain racial implications of Huck's voice, calling attention, for instance, to the way his accent gets juxtaposed against Jim's denser dialect in a way that tends to play Jim for laughs, they have failed to acknowledge what it means that Huck's voice can only be made to seem homegrown by denying indigenous peoples their voice. So within Life on the Mississippi, Twain introduces Huck's missing chapter by explaining it takes place right after Huck and Jim pass Cairo without knowing it, which is, of course, the premise that endangers their quest to seek freedom in the heart of the Free States. What's interesting is Huck is supposed to be eavesdropping on the keelboatmen to find out what happened to Cairo. but that's not what happens. Also, Jim doesn't get a single line in this chapter. Instead, the second Huck swims up, he's instantly distracted from his mission by the way the keelboatmen all fetched a kind of Injun war whoop. It was a perfect powwow, Huck tells us admiringly, noting the way the men ripped out pretty savage around their wigwam, all whooping and jawing like Indians. Indeed, once the biggest man there flung off a buckskin coat that was all hung with fringes, the narrative becomes a war of words, entirely predicated on proving which of the keelboatmen has the better claim to native belonging. All right, I'm going to step away from the mic for a sec. Woo! I'm the old, original, iron-jawed, brass-mounted, copper-bellied corpse maker from the wilds of Arkansas. Woo! I'm the bloodiest son of a wildcat that lives. Woo! Bow your neck and spread, for the kingdom of sorrows are coming. Hold me down to the earth, for I feel my powers are working. Woo! My best attempt to make this up to this level. On the one hand, it is clear that all this whooping is meant to connect keelboat talk with the dreadful war whoops that Twain describes as irresistibly wild and devilish. Of the rivermen, he says, I never saw such an Injun to yelp. On the other hand, it is equally clear that all of these wild-sounding Injuns are in fact white, as is underscored by the fact that their one-upsmanship is expressed as a series of allegories about manifest destiny. Woo-whoop! Stand back and give me room according to my strength. Blood's my natural drink, and the wails of the dying is music to my ear. Woo-whoop! Look at me! I'm the man they call sudden death and general desolation. Woo-whoop! When I'm playful, I use the meridians of longitude and parallels of latitude for ascent, and drag the Atlantic Ocean for whales. Woo-whoop! The massacre of isolated communities is the pastime of my idle moments, the destruction of nationalities, the serious business of my life. The boundless vastness of the great American desert is my enclosed property, and I bury my dead on my own premises. When Huck is inevitably discovered hiding aboard the raft and begins to talk wild himself in much the same manner, we are primed to understand the characteristic kind of language and dialect coming out of his mouth, including some pretty characteristic tall tales, as an extension of this kind of whooping, one-upsmanship, manifest destiny that we've heard from the keelboatmen. Twain, who calls himself an adoptive infant son of the keelboatmen, cannot praise the riotous powwow of river talk enough. In the manner of profanity, it was sublime, he proclaims, discharged like a blast of lightning with a long, reverberating peal of profanity thundering after it. When Twain confesses, I wish I could talk like that, we can appreciate just how thoroughly keelboat talk encapsulated for him a phase of the Mississippi River life that was unique to American soil, therefore particularly capable of representing America. I believe there has been nothing like it elsewhere in the world. Of course, the great irony of such talk is that it is, in some meaningful sense, not a domestic production at all, but rather an importation of settler colonialism. And I'm going to, again, skip ahead just a little bit. Of course, Twain faced a serious problem when it came to making this kind of imported settler colonial English seem like a natural outgrowth of local conditions, rather than a foreign intrusion perpetuated by European explorers. In his effort to overcome this problem, he borrowed a page from the logic of birthright citizenship, which, if you'll remember back, was premised on this idea of jus soli, of the soil, really coming from the earth. And in this chapter, Twain draws our attention over and over to the torrent of yellow mud that explorers find clouding the savage river, which he describes as boiling and surging and sweeping in its course logs, branches, and uprooted trees through a vast unknown of barbarism. So the river itself, native, savage, and bringing to us this mud, this incredible yellow mud, which, right after the keelboatmen argue about what ought to be done with the Injuns, they begin to praise the supposedly magical properties of the river's characteristic mud. They insist that Muddy Mississippi water was wholesomer to drink than the clear water of Ohio, because yaller Mississippi water boasted nutritiousness in the mud. One keelboatman even declares that a man that drank Mississippi water could grow corn in his stomach if he wanted to. This evocative imagery is more than just hyperbole. It serves as an agricultural analogy meant to illustrate the relationship between the land and its language. Much as native soil, yellow mud, can give rise to the cultivated riches of native-grown corn, native absorption, drinking yaller Mississippi water, can give rise to the cultivated riches of native-grown language. But whereas the soil itself might reasonably be claimed as the provenance of native tribes, and the corn too, for that matter, the language used to decide what ought to be done with the Injuns can never be imagined as any kind of prerogative of native peoples. For writers like Twain, the power of native speech is that it precludes precisely those native voices whose effect of indigeneity it exploits to impart its own sense of American belonging. Within American dialect literature, the dialectic of nativity functioned to include native-born accents, and by extension, native-born citizens themselves, only by exploiting, misappropriating, and excluding actual native voices. So indebted was Twain to Injun ways for his conception of Huckleberry Finn that he even planned to have Huck turn native after lighting out for the territory. And again, thanks to Carrie for pointing me in this direction. In his unfinished sequel, which is Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer Among the Injuns, he notes in his marginalia that H becomes converted to Native American spiritual beliefs, which is quite a statement. The consequences of Twain's obsession with the Native American traditions he simultaneously admired and abhorred go far beyond the racial implications of his most famous novel, as significant as those may be. By relying on native erasure to establish America's most emblematic narrative voice, Twain forever grounded the country's literary tradition in the effort to make the language of settlers sound more native than the native tribes they were displacing. During Twain's era, when legislators were seeking to predicate citizenship on the notion of native soil without having to extend any rights to actual natives, while simultaneously eradicating native livelihoods and cultures through land grabs and forced assimilation, only dialect literature managed to offer the country a version of what it meant to belong to the land that could never be claimed by Native Americans themselves. And during our era, when conversations about the national canon tend to revolve around diversifying the racial makeup of those who are represented within it, for good reason, dialect's effect of indigeneity reminds us that there is no version of a national literature that does not exclude some undesirable voices by design. In the end, the kind of literature that requires a state to contain it functions to perpetuate the imperialist principles at the nation's core. Congratulations, you made it!